honored to introduce our guest speaker. He currently serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development and previously held the position of director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. He served as special advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General and is currently the SDG advocate for UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He is also the author of numerous research articles, commentaries, and books, including the latest one entitled The Age of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. Our speaker is widely recognized for bold and effective strategies to address complex challenges, including human-induced climate change. For his remarkable contributions, he was twice named as Time Magazine's 100 most influential global leaders, ranked by The Economist as among the 3 most influential living economists, and the co-recipient of the 2015 Blue Planet Prize, among many other recognitions. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you world-renowned economics professor, best-selling author, innovative educator, and global leader in sustainable development, Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you for your network for education and research on peace and sustainability. It's a very inspiring and a very noble initiative, and I'm absolutely honored to be one of the first speakers in this program, and I want to commit to continuing with you on this journey. Your effort for finding pathways to peace and sustainability is the most important challenge on the planet. And how fitting that Hiroshima University leads this global effort. And I am very inspired by your undertaking this effort. Indeed, this is a shocking year and a year of anniversaries. The 75th anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, and the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, the organization that was created in the aftermath of World War II to stop future wars. And today, notably, was the opening of the General Assembly high-level segment. In other words, the opening of the 75th session of the General Assembly with the speeches by the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, the President of the General Assembly, and several world leaders, including President Trump and President Xi Jinping of China. So this is a very notable day, and my thoughts all day have been on the questions of peace and sustainability, and I'm happy to share a few thoughts with you on that. We are clearly in a very dangerous time in the world. The COVID pandemic is a worldwide crisis of proportions that we have not seen since World War II, and of economic dislocations that are on the scale of the Great Depression. They may not last as long, we hope, but they are very serious and very dislocating. So by itself, this pandemic would make the world a difficult place. But our circumstances are much more complex than the COVID-19 pandemic itself, because the context of the pandemic is also rather dramatic. Even before this year's pandemic, there were great reasons for concern about the direction of global society and the risks of war and the risks of other kinds of social and environmental calamities. I think it's fair to say that we face 3 major changes in the world order these years that altogether create a extraordinarily dangerous and difficult moment for the world. Starting with the COVID-19 epidemic, this is a reflection in significant part of a more general phenomenon of environmental crisis. The pandemic itself is another emerging disease like SARS, now COVID-19, but we've had many pandemic diseases in recent years, H1N1, or new epidemic diseases like Ebola or Zika or Nipah virus or MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. And so we're living in a period of multiple emerging diseases that reflect a more general destabilization of the natural environment. It is likely that the current disease, COVID-19, is the result of a transmission of the virus from the bat population, horseshoe bats, probably in southwest China, to human beings through some kind of interaction between humans and bat populations in a rural area in southwest China that now has spread to the entire world. But that kind of event of a zoonosis, a animal disease transferred to humans, is occurring with greater frequency because of environmental disruption. The scale of environmental disruption, of course, is even larger than that because we are in the midst of human-induced climate change, which is of a dramatic scale. The Earth's temperature is warmer now than it has been in any century of the past 10,000 years. And every year is one of the hottest years on Earth's history during the period of civilization of the last 10,000 years. So we are already destabilizing the climate as well. We are destabilizing biodiversity, as a report last week by the World Wildlife Fund showed the significant, indeed dramatic decline of other species, their abundance around the world. And we are also in the midst of a massive pollution crisis: air pollution, ocean pollution, water pollution, soil pollution. So these environmental crises are profoundly dangerous and destabilizing. They are one of the three major changes underway at the global scale. The second major change that I would point to is the rapid technological change that is underway in the digital age. We are in a period of dramatic economic disruption because of the advances of computer technologies, connectivity, and artificial intelligence. And this digital revolution is also having a profound transformation on every part of the economic life, from agriculture, production, mining, manufacturing, which have become rapidly more automated with many job losses, to the digitalization of the service economy. Of course, during this year of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have taken dramatically accelerated steps towards digitalization. Around the world, schools went online. Around the world, healthcare went online. Around the world, government services went online. Payments went online. Finance went online. Where I live, and Josh Fisher lives in New York City, a city filled with offices went to work from home almost overnight through digital technologies. These technologies are global and pervasive and accelerating disruptive economic change. Some of it very good by enabling new kinds of services, and some of it very destabilizing because many people are losing their jobs, while at the same time, the owners of these technological platforms are becoming richer than any person in human history. The owner of Amazon Incorporated, Mr. Jeffrey Bezos, has a net worth of about $200 billion at the personal level now. And just 4 Americans, Mr. Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk, the 4 of them have a net worth of $500 billion. So we are seeing people lose their jobs. At the same time, we are seeing the creation of incredible concentrations of wealth. The third major transformation, in addition to environment and technology, is geopolitical change. That's related to the technological change because countries that are mastering the new technologies are able to accelerate their economic development. And this spread of technology is therefore changing the distribution of global economic production and therefore economic power, and therefore also military or geopolitical power. And the most important change, of course, is the rising power of China, which has experienced through its successful economic policy efforts, modeled incidentally on Japanese economic strategies, I would say, China has been able to become a major economic power during a period of just 40 years. From 1980 to 2020, China went from an impoverished rural country to a modern post-industrial economy with high technology. And this is very good in my mind in terms of the living standards of the Chinese people, so very positive, but it also means major geopolitical change. And that geopolitical change is the rise of China's influence in the world political system. And this is triggering many kinds of further shocks to global diplomacy. Today, we saw it in the speech by President Donald Trump, who gave a very harsh attack on China. Now, I believe that President Trump is a very bad president and a very dangerous person. So I want to be understood as being very worried about the actions of my own country, and especially of its leadership, which I think is very poor. But the speech reflected the rising geopolitical tensions now that have come as China's power has risen and America's relative power has diminished. We are in a very different world from 1945, when the United States was by far the dominant world power. It was in 1945 with a monopoly of the atomic weapons. It produced perhaps 1/3 of the total world output. in the mid-1940s after the end of World War II. And it was understood to be the leading power and also the source of security, military security in Japan and Korea from the 1950s and 1960s and so forth. Well, this kind of US-led world is changing to a multipolar world very rapidly. And that is the third major stress, I believe, that we are facing. So if I sum this story up, we are in the midst of a very serious health crisis, a more general environmental crisis, a major disruption of the economic system with widening inequalities, and a major change of geopolitics, especially with the rise of China and the relative decline of the power of the United States. Well, all of this is a very dangerous mix because any one of these factors by itself is profoundly destabilizing. COVID-19 has by itself destabilized the world. Human-made climate change is already destabilizing much of the world with disasters each year, such as we are experiencing in the United States with massive forest fires along the Pacific coast of the United States and a rather dramatic intensification of hurricane activity in the Atlantic Ocean. But that kind of destabilization is happening in all parts of the world. The question is how we can find our way out of this complex, interconnected series of challenges and crises without, on the one side, losing peace, and on the other side, without destroying the planet or undermining social stability through further widening of income inequalities. And as a general matter, it is my belief that it is only through the path of sustainable development that we can find solutions to these crises. The idea of sustainable development is that we should reorient or transform our economies so that they function in a more socially inclusive way or a more socially just way to narrow the income inequalities and address the needs of the poorest people in our society. And at the same time that we transform our technological basis from pollution and fossil fuels that create climate change and from unsustainable farm practices to sustainable diets and sustainable land use and farm practices, so that we can create a world economy that has more shared prosperity, more social justice, and environmental sustainability. I think there are two huge questions about this idea. First, is it feasible? Is there such thing as a path to a world that is prosperous, fair, and environmentally sustainable? Could we even conceive of such a world? And second, if we can conceive of such a world, how could we practically achieve that through politics and through global efforts? On the first question of the feasibility of sustainable development, I would answer in a short phrase that it is feasible to achieve sustainable development, mainly through two different means. One is technological transformation to shift from polluting activities and fossil fuels to circular economy and renewable energy, and to do this on a time period of roughly 30 years, so that by the middle of this century, we have escaped from the pollution and the fossil fuels to a new, clean, green technological system for the world. I've been studying the feasibility of such a transformation for at least 10 years now. And I believe that our power of our digital technologies and the high efficiency of renewable energy is sufficiently advanced that we can make such a transformation. The other thing that we need to do is to have well-functioning public services in healthcare, in education, in social protection, so that our government services ensure that nobody and no part of society is left behind in poverty or in distress or in homelessness or in hunger, but rather that we use public services to ensure universal protection and universal inclusion of people. This requires active government that is able to provide public services of high quality and able to tax sufficiently those with higher incomes to be able to make transfers to those in need. And that we have also a system in place where the richer countries also support the poorer countries, so that the poorer countries too can achieve the universal coverage of crucial services. I also would add that if we have universal access to digital technologies such as broadband internet and 5G systems, this will facilitate social inclusion, because everybody could then have access to online education or telemedicine or banking services, or access to electronic payments by the government for social protection. So from a technical point of view, I believe that sustainable development can enable us to address the environmental crises as well as the social crises. But then comes the question of whether this is politically achievable. And there, my starting point is that it is not politically achievable in a world of nationalism and in a world of geopolitical stress. The only way these goals could be achieved is through global cooperation, in which we decide as a community of nations that nations will work together to achieve these goals. Now, the good news is that all governments did agree on the Sustainable Development Goals. All governments did agree on the Paris Climate Agreement. So it is feasible to have global cooperation. The bad news, however, is that some governments now reject those ideas, and the lead government in rejection is unfortunately the US government itself under Donald Trump, because he is an extremist, right-wing nationalist. So he is a great danger to the idea of global cooperation, and I believe the biggest danger to peace on the planet. So it didn't surprise me, though it did very much stress me, that when he spoke at the UN this morning, he was the one that made direct attacks on China. This is part of the right-wing ideology in the United States, a hyper-nationalist ideology, which says that the United States must be the dominant country in the world. And if any other country threatens the dominance of the United States, it becomes an enemy. And it is a kind of divisive mentality that is, to my mind, the most important source of danger in the world today. The conflict between the US and China is not a conflict over resources. It's not really a conflict over economics. It is a conflict over power itself. And mainly a conflict because American nationalists oppose the rise of China to a position of authority and responsibility, I should say. So a big question for me is whether we can have a global system in which countries can become rich and powerful and not trigger threats to the existing powers, and especially the United States. The US is trying to build an alliance of countries, including Japan, to stand against China. This, in my view, is a very bad and dangerous idea. And I don't think Japan should view the US as the ally that will protect it against China. I do believe that Japan should reach out to China for good bilateral relations and not see this as a matter of two blocks of China versus an American-led bloc, because that kind of mentality is the kind of mentality that eventually leads to war. And what we need instead is a mentality of cooperation where the world is not divided between those who side with the US and those who are against it, but rather the world is united in a common purpose for sustainable development, for fighting COVID-19 pandemic, for shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy, for helping the poorest countries to make advances. And in that kind of world, we would not face the threats and the dangers of some kind of new Cold War, which could then, unfortunately, create the conditions for a new hot war. So this is what I try to envision. And I would especially like to see Asia, and especially East Asia, find a way to avoid sharp divisions, rather than Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand trying to line up against China. I would rather that we find a way for Japan, Korea, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, and China to work all together in trade relations, in technology, in fighting epidemic diseases, in engaging in cultural exchange, because that kind of world will be a lot safer than a world in which we have a new Cold War. That, to my mind, is the greatest danger of all that we face. To accomplish this, we probably need to reform the United Nations system. We need to reform the Security Council. We need to help facilitate more regional integration as a basic strategy for global problem solving. And I believe we need to find ways to express common human values in a very direct way that we really haven't done adequately, to show that at the core, humanity subscribes to basic values of human dignity and human rights and peace, and to be very clear about that, like we were at the start of the United Nations with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I see this 75th anniversary of the UN and the COVID crisis as an occasion to reinvigorate multilateralism. Now, I'm hoping that in early November, Donald Trump is defeated in the US election, because if he is defeated, we have a much better chance to accomplish these goals. If he is reelected, I have very, very significant fears that we will enter a period of even greater instability, where Trump will try to create an alliance against China, which could become an extremely dangerous situation for the world. So a lot will depend, in my opinion, on the politics in the United States in the coming weeks. If Vice President Biden is elected, this will be our opportunity in the United States to reestablish a far more cooperative foreign policy and to reach out to all countries, I hope, for cooperation on the environment, on narrowing income inequalities, on sharing technologies, and on suppressing the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll wait to see, but I know either way, the work that your network is doing will be extremely important in the years ahead to show how we can use the path of sustainability to help underpin global cooperation and to help make the case for peace. Thank you for what you're doing. I look forward to the discussion with Dr. Joshua Fisher and with all of the participants. Thank you again for having me today.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. Now I invite the Director of AC4 at Columbia University, Dr. Joshua Fisher, to initiate the discussion with his commentary.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening or this morning in Japan. I want to start by thanking the esteemed leadership of Hiroshima University for convening this space, Professor Kaneko for opening this invitation for Professor Sachs and myself to join, to Professor Sachs specifically for his eloquence and agility and directness with which he addresses these really important and salient topics, and to the NERPS faculty and staff for the important work that you're doing. I've been impressed since the creation of the network on your vision of peace and your understanding of the integration of peace and sustainability. It's been a real honor to be tangentially associated with the network, and I really look forward to continuing to support it as you advance the goals that were laid out in the opening of the seminar. Professor Sachs opened his discussion with a presentation of 3 major changes in the world and a roadmap by which we can attempt to overcome those challenges. And I want to situate that in the context specifically of peace. And so the way I want to do this is just quickly understanding conflict and peace as processes of change. So the world is changing. Professor Sachs laid out the 3 sorts of existential changes that are happening concurrently that are all themselves a set of feedback processes on each other. And conflict is often the product of change because change illuminates or highlights incompatible needs, interests, goals, and values among diverse stakeholders. And once those incompatibilities are highlighted, it requires the renegotiation of existing relationships or the negotiation of new relationships among the stakeholders. And that negotiation process can go smoothly, it can go less smoothly. When it goes less smoothly, we end up with destructive conflict. And that happens when the stakeholders involved lose faith in the ability of the institutions and structures that govern social interaction to help them meet their needs, interests, goals, objectives, values. But when the stakeholders trust in those institutions, believe that the institutions will enable them to pursue their own needs, interests, etc., then we get constructive conflict. We get a social process wherein innovation is possible. So we understand, in the academy at least, we understand conflict as a function of change. Unfortunately, we've tended to view peace as a more static process, a state to achieve, or a state to not lose, rather than understanding it as a dynamic social process. The network on education and research on peace and sustainability, though, has a different vision of peace, where it sees it as a dynamic living process. And under that view, peace can be thought of as the ongoing process for individuals and groups of self-actualization, mutual reciprocal support across groups. And that for both the self and the group actualization to be possible, we need an enabling context, environmentally, socially, politically, economically, that can allow stakeholders to define their own needs, their own interests, pursue their own values, without doing so at the expense of others. In other words, we need to understand peace as sustainable development, as Professor Sachs so eloquently described. Another economist, Paul Collier, once referred to conflict as development in reverse. And so I'd like to challenge us all to think of peace as sustainable development moving forward. And so what are the components of this new vision of peace, or how is it possible? Well, I'd like to suggest there are three processes, social processes, that are embedded in this process of peace. First is coordination among diverse sets of stakeholders with unique sets of values or expectations or goals related to their own lives and the lives of others. And so incompatibilities are inherent in our sustainability dilemmas, so we need to coordinate among these stakeholders in order to uncover potential incompatibilities and problem solve around those. Next, again, as Professor Sachs said, we need a process of collaboration or cooperation toward mutual gains. We need to be able to see the economic system, the geopolitical system, the environmental systems as integrative rather than distributive. We need to switch from sort of a distributive mindset where it's a zero-sum game with a fixed pie to an integrative mindset that enables us to understand that we each bring information, resources, and knowledge into the collaboration space. And through that, the addition of all of these different sets of value, we can create more value than just a fixed pie. And so switching from that distributive to integrative mindset enables value creation that can help to overcome some of the scarcity problems and dilemmas. And the third component, the third social process in this larger peace process, is the regulation of competition. The Western world particularly has been hyper-focused on competition as the driver of innovation, the driver of success, the driver of actualization. But that mindset itself tends towards zero sum. But if we can switch to the more integrative mindset, then we can understand competition as potentially useful, potentially value additive, as long as it's not at the expense of others, as long as it's in that integrative space. And so moving towards some sort of Pareto optimality where we can still define and pursue our own interests without it being at the expense of others. For those social processes to happen, I'd like to encourage us to think about the sorts of equity that need to be created in our international system. And I'd like to do that specifically in terms of three types of justice. First, procedural justice, the ways in which we decide which objectives to pursue as nations, as individuals, as companies, and as a global community need to be fair, need to be inclusive, and each member of a society or a global society needs to understand the process, it needs to be transparent, and they need to feel that the process itself is just. Second, a set of distributive justice, wherein the outcomes of negotiations, the outcomes of political readjustments and renegotiations are fair and equitable. And stakeholders to environmental and social dilemmas feel that, that the outcomes are distributively just. And then the third type of justice is retributive justice, wherein the mechanisms by which we enforce these outcomes and processes are themselves fair. The ways in which we hold stakeholders to account are fair, the rules are transparent, and the enforcement mechanisms themselves are conducted jointly across the stakeholders. And so I believe that understanding peace as a social process is really understanding peace as the process of sustainable development. And I think that, as Professor Sachs said, that equity is critical, but equity has to occur on these three levels: the process, the outcomes, and the enforcement. And so when we think about peace, not as a stable state to achieve or maintain, not from the perspective of negative peace, but rather from this idea of a social process, I think we can see the direct integration of environmental sustainability and social sustainability or social development that's equitable, just, and fair. So I'd like to challenge the network as you pursue your work over the next coming years to really advance our understanding of how we can implement these different types of justice in our global agreements, in our corporate agreements, and in our social spaces. The questions that Professor Sachs raised on how we can bring people to the table, how we can overcome power imbalances are real, and they're salient, and they're not easy. And so I think the network has a lot of value to add in bringing answers or advancing solutions to those problems. So again, thank you everyone for the work that you're doing. Thank you, Professor Sachs, for a really eloquent and direct summary of the challenges and roadmap for how we can address them, and look forward to the conversation as well. Thank you.
Great, wow. Thank you very much. Those are wonderful points, very powerfully and clearly put. And I'd like to quote for everybody from my favorite speech by a US president, John F. Kennedy's peace speech in 1963, which is a good resource for NERPS also. You know, President Kennedy in 1963 was trying to determine how to make peace with the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis had almost led to mutual annihilation. And he made a wonderful campaign for peace. I wrote a book about this a number of years ago called John F. Kennedy's Quest for Peace to Move the World. And he gave a speech in June 1963, which is an incredible analysis of peace, but it says exactly what Josh just said. And I just wanted to read a couple sentences from it because it's very interesting, and Josh put it exactly the same way. President Kennedy said, "There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts." And then he says, "It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems." And I think it's a beautiful statement. Peace is a process, a way of solving problems. And it's an extremely important concept that we're not trying to find that equilibrium. We're trying to find a way to address the ongoing life of global society that faces constant change. And that's also why I'm a great skeptic of a lot of international relations theory, of balance of power theory. My reading of history is there's no such thing as balance of power. There is only shifting power, changing power. And if you try to get the balance of power, it may lead to peace for some period, but when the power structure changes, unless there's the underpinning of process, the peace will break down, perhaps catastrophically. And in the most famous, perhaps, example of this was the European balance of power in the 19th century under Bismarck, first Metternich, then Bismarck. But it broke down in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. And with that breakdown, eventually came World War I and global catastrophe. It's also true, and Japan itself is an exemplar of this. Peace is at risk when there's a major change of relative power. And when Japan undertook the most remarkable economic reform in history, in my view, which was the 1868 Meiji Restoration, which led to Japan's rapid industrialization. By the 1890s, Japan was so powerful relative to the Asian neighbors that Japan embarked on its period of empire building. First in war with China in 1895, then the Sino-Japanese War, and then the Russia-Japan War, and the colonization of Korea, and then, of course, the invasion of China in the 1930s. And this resulted from success, in a way, economically, the imbalance of power. There's also the phenomenon that I referred to, and I think has been very well written about by Professor Graham Allison at Harvard in the last couple of years, the so-called Thucydides trap, that a rising power threatens an established power and makes it more likely that war will ensue. And this is taken from history, at least one reading of history, that the rise of Athens in the 5th century BC led to the war between Sparta and Athens, and that the rise of China could provoke conflict between China and the US. And here, I think Japan can play a major role by not simply siding with the US in ganging up on China, or seeming to, but rather reaching out to China for close relations of neighboring countries that have huge potential gain with each other, and not viewing the relationship as an intrinsically hostile relationship. So these are very important issues of vision of the process of accommodating changing relative power in the years ahead. But I just want to congratulate Josh, because I think he put it very, very well, and emphasize this process point that lies ahead.